Talking about imagination, I can talk about poetic imagination, I can talk about visual imagination, and I can talk about social imagination. And one of the, this is just again an account of very private experience. I take the same bus to Teachers College almost every day of my life, or I did, to such an extent that I almost never saw anything, although I never saw Central Park, I never saw the children playing, I never saw the slum. You become dead to the world because it loses itself in habit and familiarity. And for a long time, well, still, there are empty houses north of Central Park North toward Harlem. And I was looking at the windows, and they looked like empty eye sockets to me. They looked like, because they're empty, and they're tragic in their emptiness. And I started again playing with metaphors and thinking how the very look of the window and moving in the space of my own consciousness to thinking of other windows, to thinking of painters like Romare Bearden, to think of painters like Ben Shahn, who painted the city, added not only to my noticing, but added in some way to my outrage that there should be empty windows like that, that there should be homeless people like that. I want to believe that that more and more people can be made capable of indignation through engagement with novels, with paintings, and so on. I want, as I think so many of us do, to awaken people not only to see, not only to feel, but to hold somebody's hand and to act. And that's why we talk about, I talk about and try to talk about social imagination. Last year we had a conference at Teachers College, and I don't know if you ever heard of Paulo Freire, but Paulo Freire had died recently, and I knew him sort of, and so we had half of the conference sort of dedicated to Paulo Freire. And I remember Paulo Freire's great interest in art, great interest in the imagination, saying that if peasants do not have a notion of a lovelier world, they're never moved to try to transform the world that there is. It's a very, Sartre, the great existentialist, says something similar. He talks about workers in the 19th century French factory, how resigned they were to working God knows how many hours a week, until somebody like a trade union person comes to the door and begins talking about a better way of life. And it's only when you think of a better way of life do you find what exists unendurable. And that's the use of imagination. It's the, I guess you would say, it's the utopian thrust of imagination. Knowing how rare that is today, knowing even in my own life, when I compare what it's like today for so many young kids and what it was like when I was in college and later, to feel that there was a cause worth fighting for, to feel that some march you were on or some letter you wrote would somehow or another contribute to changing the world. And I look around to young people who say there are no causes anymore. And in some way, to engage children with the arts, in thinking of things as if they could be otherwise, might make the difference. I'm going to end only with one selection from one of Adrienne Rich's poems. Adrienne Rich, who said, real social transformation, real change has to come out of a love of life and a love of the world. which gives another responsibility to the teacher. In a poem, What Kind of Times Are These?, she wrote about our country moving closer to its own truth and dread, its own ways of making people disappear. And then, I won't tell you where the place is, the dark mesh of the woods meeting the unmarked strip of light, like ghost-ridden crossroads, leaf-mold paradise. I know already who wants to buy it, sell it, make it disappear. And I won't tell you where it is. So why do I tell you anything? Because you still listen. Because in times like these, to have you listen at all, it's necessary to talk about trees. And then she was talking to Bill Moyers, and she said, there are different kinds of dread for many different kinds of people. I think that more and more people feel uncared for, feel that their lives are not only unvalued but meaningless, feel that though they may care for their lives, no one else will, feel that the only way they can protect their survival and interests is by the gun. I'm afraid that many people feel an enormous desperation which plays into the propaganda of hate. So Moyers asked her how she could say such bitter things and still write such affirmative poems. And she said, if poetry, this is where I'll end, but it's what I've been trying in a much rougher language to say. If poetry is forced by the conditions in which it's created to speak of dread and bitter, bitter conditions, by its very nature, poetry speaks beyond to something different. That's why poetry can bring together those parts of us which exist in dread, and those which have the surviving sense of a possible happiness, collectivity, community, a loss of isolation. And that's really the point I try sometimes desperately to make, the consciousness of possibility, the need to reach out against the undeniable dread and against the black wall. And thank you. And if I went on too long, Craig, forgive me. Thank you. Thank you very much. Any questions? Oh, you're so kind. To make me forgive United Airlines. I mean, U.S. Air. Thank you. Thank you. You're so good to me. I don't deserve it.